with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So I've written about changes in lifestyles and work that actually already started happening well before the pandemic. But this is, of course, going on now. It has actually gained momentum. So I've written about individuals who moved from cities to rural areas in pursuit of experimental lifestyles. For example, sharing accommodation to cut down costs, pursuing multiple jobs rather than just one, but also scaling down activities that that people do not see as meaningful to them. So ultimately, this quest is really about finding one's waku waku, as it's called in Japanese. It's a term which refers to a sense of passion, vibrancy, drive, something that makes kind of ascribes meaningfulness to people's lives. So it's really about finding sustainability and trying to create sustainable lifestyles. The other side of the coin of waku waku is, of course, a sense of uncertainty, because many of the people I've talked to have given up their jobs in stable employment. So they're living very much in the here and now. They are kind of hedging their bets, trying to do several things at once to cut down on the risk and the like. So I've written about this in my book, Urban Migrants in Rural Japan, Between Agency and Anomia Post-Growth Society. And the data is really introduced in the book, and some of which I also talk about today, is based on more than 100 interviews conducted across Japan over a period of 9 years. And last year, I've done follow-up fieldwork in Tokushima and engaging participant observation as well. Plus, recently I've also done additional online interviews to finish up. So I'd like to start with 3 episodes that show these kinds of emerging paradigm shifts. And first, just to start out with, when we think about rural areas and rural fieldwork, lots of people tend to think about folklore, about farming, and about senior citizens mostly. But in my case, the daily life as a rural field worker looked quite different. This is just an arbitrary episode from an interview site. This is a company called Food Hub that I've been observing for quite a while now. And it's just the office where people are working, and people sometimes come from this area in Tokushima, but a lot of times they're actually from other places. They have working history in Osaka, in Tokyo. So doing fieldwork in rural areas is a lot about exploring fusion, exploring various things coming together rather than a bounded, clear-cut entity. And this is really what I'm interested in, trying to pinpoint the kind of mixed fusion aspects of people and things going on. So let's move on into the 3 episodes. First, leaving Tokyo behind. From around 2020, there were clear signs that more and more people have decided to leave Tokyo rather than move to Tokyo. So the classic pattern until now was always that Tokyo continued to attract people from all over the place. You can see that in the first half of the year, 2020, there's still more people moving to Tokyo. But then from around May of that year, people started to leave the red boxes. So there is a very clear kind of shift in the game. And this has been going on ever since. The graph on the right-hand side is from Tokyo newspaper, Tokyo Shimbun. And it shows the development from 2019 up to 21. And you can see that in Tokyo, on the very left side, it's very big decrease in people moving into Tokyo. And at the same time, you can also see that on these kind of three boxes on the right-hand side, this is Kanagawa Prefecture, Saitama Prefecture, and Chiba Prefecture. So these neighboring prefectures in the larger Tokyo area have started to attract newcomers. A little bit, not too much, but a little bit. So it's kind of obvious. The white one is 2021. They are growing in population. So there is a clear shift in the game that people have decided to leave Tokyo behind, keep their jobs, of course, but find a new place of residence where they can actually enjoy the benefits of rural living and keep their work. So this is a new development. Episode 2 is about new forms of working. So I meet up with Taku, a former salaryman in his early 30s, back in December 2021. Taku, he used to work as a salaryman in Tokyo in IT marketing for 8 years. And then he decided to move overseas at the age of 30 because he wanted to get something, to see something else in life. So he opted for Estonia, which may be quite an amazing surprise. But his reason for choosing Estonia was really that it's strong on IT, and his work being related to IT, it seemed an obvious choice. So he managed to survive his first long-term overseas stay during the pandemic, managed to come back in early 2021 to Japan. And he decided to actually not go back to Tokyo, but move to Nagasaki, a small rural town in southern Japan. And in doing so, he signed up for one of these co-living services you can see on the right that are catering to nomad workers, to remote workers, where people pay a given price per month and also get free internet access, and they can actually use facilities of that company across Japan. So it's not only one place, but they have a network of accommodations available for people, for members. So Taku's idea was to try living in Nagasaki for 1 month, see how it goes. And he ended up liking it so much, he decided to prolong his stay. So he says, right now, I don't earn anything at all, but the advantage of working freelance, that I can pick what I do. I can design my own work and life. If I don't come up with ideas, nothing will come forward. Of course I worry, but, and I'm super anxious. There is definitely uncertainty in this lifestyle. But I don't try to get rid of it, but rather try to live and coexist with it. So Taku aspires to a lifestyle that allows him to work just the amount he feels comfortable with, and of course also pays his bills. Many of my interlocutors over the years are talking about this right amount, just the right amount. But very few actually seem to be able to put this into practice, and many struggling to make ends meet or also end up engaging in self-exploitative practices. So we can actually see that there's quite a gap between aspiration and reality for most people. So shakaijin, the Japanese term for person of society, a working member of society, conventionally carried connotations of commuting into the office every day so far, but with the pandemic, things have been changing. Quite a few people have started remote working, and especially privileged members of the working population have the right to work from their homes for some extent. So things are definitely changing. Episode 3. At every Zoom meeting we are seeing bits of people's lives without actually physically moving. So, and this was pointed out by Tim Cresswell at an online talk recently. So we end up seeing the pets of our research collaborators, the pet research assistants of our presenters at conferences like yesterday. And I'm sure some of you remember that epic interview on BBC with this researcher. You can see on the right where his kids crawled into the picture while he was being interviewed. So this has really highlighted the clear entanglement of the sedentary and mobile perspectives. And also we need to really rethink the meanings of space, home, and sociality. When we are on Zoom, what is here? What does it mean to talk about here? What does it mean to talk about now? So all these 3 episodes clearly indicate that we acutely need to rethink conventional paradigms like urban, rural, work, leisure, and sedentary and mobile. Something that I'll come back to later. So Japan is an extremely centralized country with key companies, educational facilities, and governmental bodies being situated mostly in Tokyo. 51.6% of residents live in Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya. So it's not surprising that rural areas have largely been associated with farming and cheap manual labor, and everyone who would aspire to a better life would leave. However, according to a recent data bank survey by Teikoku Data Bank conducted in 2021, as many as 351 companies moved their headquarters from Greater Tokyo to rural areas last year, more than ever before. And the most common places of relocation are Osaka Prefecture and Hokkaido. Another important trend is the term vacation in Japanese, the combination of work and vacation that we've already heard about yesterday. So this has been promoted by the central government to entice corporate employees to work in the countryside for a limited period of time and bring in their families with them to enjoy quality time. On the left side, you can see a kind of PR advertisement for vacation options in the Seto-Ichi Inner Sea. And on the right-hand side, this is from the Japan Vacation Association homepage, which shows that the network of officially acknowledged vacation concierges, as it's called in Japanese, is already quite extensive and spreads across Japan. So vacation has also been heavily supported by the Japan Tourism Agency, which allocated 5 billion Japanese yen in its 2021 budget to vacation-related activities. So more and more companies have offered this option to their employees, and increasing number of hotels have also started to revamp their rooms and facilities to accommodate vacationers rather than foreign tourists, since Japan has shut its borders since the onset of the pandemic. So what future awaits rural areas and its communities, and what implications does this have for the future of tourism? I'd like to reflect on this from 3 different angles. First, rethinking forms of tourism. Second, rethinking locality and urban rural. And third, rethinking sedentary and mobile lifestyles. And I'd like to start with this poster, a quite recent poster from the Saitama prefectural government, which is entitled Saitama Monogatari, Saitama Story. And it's clearly a take on Ozu Yasujiro's epic movie from the 1950s called Tokyo Story, which was really about fraying family relations. And this, as a counterpart, actually says that if the people who relocate to Saitama, they will be able to enjoy a better family life. They will have closer family relations. So they are kind of playing with the kind of promise of better family coexistence with this relocation, trying to appeal to individuals who might be interested. Saitama, just being next to Tokyo, as I said before, may not be the first rural area that comes to mind. It's more like a bed town, but the picture is quite nostalgic, I think, with this black and white family presentation. So this poster also is a kind of example of the increasing competition that the pandemic has meant for many suburban or rural communities, because it's a golden opportunity for them, of course, to boost their rapidly dwindling populations. So let's go on and rethink forms of tourism. We've already heard about this yesterday, but clearly the pandemic has enforced saturation trends of global tourism. And since the numbers had been growing explosively before the pandemic, people had already been looking for slower and more sustainable forms of traveling before the pandemic. And now, with some places already trying to being in a more stable situation, people have seem to be interested in traveling smaller distances and spend more time in one place. They also seem to be interested in closer relations with local communities. So the buzzword that's been around, and that was also mentioned yesterday, is regenerative tourism. And this is really about making a positive impact on local communities and economies. And as a quite immediate example of this, I'd like to show these two pictures that were taken during my follow-up fieldwork last year in May and April and May in Tokushima. So this is a newcomer from, on the left side, a newcomer from Kyushu, and a short-term visitor from Osaka. And we are all working in this small vegetable field under the guidance of our host, the owner of a guest house, who I'll introduce in a minute. And we are we're looking after the plants, the vegetables, making sure that we pull out the weed, and we make sure that all the plants are in the right distance. So it's 2 hours of working on the grounds, having occasional chats. So it's something that both the newcomer and the tourist enjoyed quite a lot. It may seem a very trivial activity, but I think it was a win-win situation for everyone involved, because we managed to help our hosts, local hosts, who are doing these fields for self-sufficiency. And since most people do not do the fields as a full-time activity, but just as a hobby, they're quite thankful for any support they can receive. And for us, it was a great opportunity to learn about many things that we do not get in touch with normally. So I think regenerative tourism has a lot of potential in the future. And I'd like to move on to our host, Rena-san, who is the owner of the guest house that I was staying for the follow-up fieldwork, and other people, lots of other people were also using last year. So Rena is originally from Tokyo area. She's in her early 30s, and she's saying, I think that life should be fun above everything. Otherwise, it's just too stressful. Having fun, helping others, and not suffering are the main things needed to achieve a balanced life, in my opinion. Personally, it makes me happy if I can see the faces of people I work for, rather than sitting in some office every day. End of quote. So Rena studied international development at university. She then worked in Bangladesh for 2 years. And after that, she couldn't envisage herself going back to Tokyo, going back to an office job. So she signed up for a regional revitalization cooperation officer job in the small town in Tokushima Prefecture. Doing this job for 2 years, she made all the important contacts necessary, and then she set up her guest house in this idyllic spot in the mountains. And she's saying, my way to go about things may be low risk, low return. So a lot of the things in the guest house are DIY. This is a picture of the porch, veranda with a beautiful view, panorama view. And you can also see that it's actually quite South Asian looking. It's quite experimental. There's kind of, on the left, you can see some rice that's being dried. She actually planted in a field for herself, and she's preparing this rice for her guests. But rather than the traditional omotenashi hospitality that we can find in conventional Japanese accommodation and hotels, her recipe is more like guests should also actually help and participate in preparations. So we would always be cooking together, and everyone would bring some stuff, and we would have a really delicious meal with a lot of surprises every day. There was also a great craft beer brewery in this town, so the beer was also wonderful, and people could take a workshop on how to prepare curries in a Bangladesh way. So it was quite cosmopolitan cuisine that was available in this town, in this house. So there were lots of opportunities for local engagement if people were interested. And I think this may be also the reason why the guest house has been so popular. In addition to the guest house, Rena has been working all kinds of small jobs like writing, cleaning, looking after children. So she's always busy doing this and that. And this is something that a lot of newcomers actually have in common. They have very little leisure time, and they're always on the rush in a way. But at the same time, they're quite happy about their lives. So when a neighbor drops in and brings fresh vegetables and chats for an entire hour, I really admired Jen's patience. And she was saying social capital is all we have. So we need to be really careful about our relations with everybody. End of quote. So talking about social capital, I would like to introduce a new concept today, which is anxious tourism or anxious tourist, which I would like to coin to describe a group of individuals between 20 and 40 who travel to rural areas in their quest for something better, something new, a change of routine. And such anxious tourism quite strongly draws on a concept I described in my book, Urban Migrants, which is moratorium migration, a crossover between lifestyle and precariat. Moratorium migration refers to the coalescence of hope and feeling of transience and permanent limbo. It is a mechanism to which individuals in different life stages resort to in order to hedge their bets, gain time, and seek assurance, inspiration, and courage to do what they ultimately feel makes sense to them in a neoliberal age. Moratorium migration fuses the previously contradictory elements of lifestyle and precariat into a fuzzy gray zone where work, lifestyle, leisure, self-realization, and precariousness all blend into one. So I also draw on Angela McRobbie's understanding of mobility, which doesn't quite know where it's going. We tend to think that mobility is always, especially lifestyle mobility, is always highly functional, very goal-oriented, and people know exactly why they're moving. But in fact, my own experience has been quite different. Of course, concepts like lifestyle migration by Michaela Benson and Karen O'Reilly assume that people move for mostly non-economic reasons to achieve a better life. But in many cases, people are not totally sure why they are moving to rural areas. And they're hoping to find an answer to that after relocating. But for many people, they don't manage to find a clear-cut answer. So I'm calling these people anxious because they're restless. They're always on the lookout for new things. Yet many do not seem to find what they're looking for. They aspire to what they imagine as tightly knit rural communities, yet they dread social pressures and are not confident that they could muster up the courage for small talk. Many mention social media as the entry point to a community. That is the post of a friend or acquaintance about the community as the first step that evoked their interest. So for these anxious tourists, experiences are key. Rather than wanting to accumulate souvenirs during the short stay in the countryside, they're interested in brief encounters with local residents and lifestyles. So this is why experiences such as working in the field that I was talking about a minute ago make so much sense for them. So let's move on to point 2, rethinking locality and urban-rural hybridity. Previous scholarship on rural Japan and rurality in general mostly presented rural areas as the counterpart of cities, and so rural areas typically embodied the past, stagnation, and was associated with senior citizens. But recently, human geography and also other disciplines have seen the emergence of more nuanced, more multifaceted views of the countryside. And just one example is this brand new edited volume by Menelaos Gartsios and others called Rural Places and Planning, Stories from the Global Countryside. So this idea that the countryside really attracts a multiplicity of influences and is not a homogeneous entity, is gaining tractions. And another edited volume, Rethinking Locality in Japan by Sonja Ganseford and Hanno Jentsch, has also included this kind of spreading out of the countryside, if you like. So my colleague Paul Hansen has written about a combination of urban values and aesthetic tastes that enter rural locations from the outside of metropolitan centers. And he referred to this as urbane, rural and urban. I myself have written about localized yet deterritorialized lives in rural Japan in the same volume when I describe entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs moving into rural hamlets and deeply engaging with the local communities, but also drawing on networks that go well beyond these communities. And my colleague, John Pagan, has written about cosmopolitan rurality neither fitting neatly into the framework of the urban nor the rural, when he describes female returnees who engage in entrepreneurial activities in Iwate Prefecture in northeastern Japan. So we can say that generally this kind of idea that the countryside is really consisting of many elements of fusion and assemblage is gaining ground. And this is also not only in academic literature, but also in media representations. We find many of such urbane representations, to borrow Paul Hansen's term. These are 2 examples of recent lifestyle magazines for women and for men. And you can see that this very fashionable urban looking model being the kind of natural setting. And of course, this is the female magazine. And then you'd find the male magazine focusing on outdoor activities, camping, etc. I'm not going to comment on the gender implications of this. But so it's obvious also on media representations that the countryside is has been represented in a new, more nuanced way. So let's move on to the 3rd point, rethinking sedentary lifestyles, which is really about the kind of clear-cut division between sedentary people who live in one place all their lives and people on the move. There was a kind of clear-cut divide. But with the pandemic, this has become more fuzzy. And if we look at even governmental initiatives, this change has also become evident. So, for example, the Kishida government presented a plan, the Digital Garden City National Plan, late last year. And this is really about trying to bridge the gap between urban and rural areas through digitalization and trying to expand and enforce digital tools and networks in rural areas to improve people's well-being also. For example, being able to offer medical consultation online for senior citizens who are living in a very remote location. So change is also happening at the governmental level, we could say. And to trying to pull all these loose threads together, I'd like to refer to the notion of immobility by Mimi Scheller. She's saying, quote, "The use of immobilities is meant to signal that mobility and immobility are always connected, relational, and codependent, such that we should always think of them together, not as binary opposites, but as dynamic constellations of multiple scales, simultaneous practices, and relational meanings," end of quote. And I'm showing this picture here because this is actually from a guest house in Furano, Hokkaido. This guest house was set up by a young couple from Kansai, Western Japan. And these are gadgets they brought back from the 1-year world trip around the world. So even if they have settled in Hokkaido and kind of are committed to making the guest house work, they still have these objects that are very much related with an immobile lifestyle with them. And I think this is a symbol of the entanglement of mobility and immobility on a daily level. I'd like to share one more story to think a little bit about this entanglement of sedentary and mobile lifestyles. And this is the story of Yuka, a lifestyle migrant who is in her late 20s. And she is interested in a lifestyle that is more in tune with the environment. And her aim is really to combine activities outdoor with educational activities for children. So this picture on the left is from a workshop to make mud pies with natural resources. So kids were encouraged to play along, find different things outside and turn them into mud pies. Everyone was extremely enthusiastic, and it's not surprising that Yuka is very popular with the kids of this small town in Tokushima. Yuka is also originally from Tokyo, but moved to the small town a year ago. And 3-year-old Aikikun, who you can see on the right-hand side with this yellow umbrella, pops in occasionally to share with us that he has found a roly-poly bug, a dango moshi. So it's clear that the children are extremely happy with the activities. And Yuka actually also says, "I enjoy this work so much. I sometimes think whether this really counts as work. Usually you have to change into the work mode, right? The work I do is different. I don't have pangs of guilt about this gap, but I've thought about this. For me, work and life are directly related." And frankly, just thinking about having to pay 70,000 Japanese yen for rent, I don't think I could get myself into this mindset. And also, I couldn't pay it in the first place. She laughs. Here, my partner and I live in a house surrounded by nature, and just getting up in the morning and looking outside is stunning. It's like living in Heidi's world. I have a fig tree just outside of the house, and I can just pick fruits if I feel like it. Asked about whether her activities aim at getting out of the capitalist economy, Yuka nods. Quote, "I'm interested. I wonder what are other options. In Japan, you get a wide variety of options lined up neatly, but I think there are other options beyond these. I think it takes time to get outside of the system, but I believe it's worth trying." This being said, Yuka also admits to liking high-end sweets, cheeses and foods mostly available in Tokyo, just as attending art museums is also a leisure activity she misses in the countryside. So lifestyle migrants seem firmly invested in their new places of residence. Yet many mention that when they stay in a place for some time, they feel like moving on. Yuka confesses that she feels overwhelmed by the sense of being surveilled by local residents at times. Just taking an occasional walk outside of the town and getting to the next hamlet provides a huge relief for her. Becoming a nobody is impossible in a small town like this, she points out. There is a feeling of restlessness and constant pressure that seems in contrast with a sense of satisfaction many settlers mention at first sight. Yet, thinking about it, it all comes together when we consider precariousness to be a human condition, and as being a condition that is inherent to humans and non-humans. Judith Butler defined precariousness as a socio-ontological dimensions of lives and bodies. Drawing on Butler's work, Isabelle Lauray argues that precariousness designates something that is existentially shared, an endangerment of bodies that is ineluctable and hence not to be secured, not only because they are mortal, but specifically because they are social, end of quote. Lauray also makes the important point that precarization is not an exception. It is rather the rule. And in a very similar vein, Anat Singh says that precarity once seemed the fate of the less fortunate. Now it seems that all our lives are precarious, even when for the moment our pockets are lined. So Lauray describes precarization as, quote, living with the unforeseeable, with contingency. Lifestyle migrants tend to interpret contingency as a benefit rather than as a threat, as many of them have discarded so-called stable jobs. And here the aspect of precariousness as productive comes in. People just take it as something granted, something that naturally occurs, and try to turn it into something positive, just like Taku, who came back from Estonia. So self-realization and self-exploitation often coalesce in individual practices and narratives, as I also show in my monograph, Urban Migrants. So in this time of ongoing uncertainty, what I'm essentially concerned in this talk is the question of how we can establish more inclusive and diverse systems, mobilities, and relationships that are good for us, good for society, and good for the planet and beyond. I would like to advocate for an emphasis on post-growth. That is the perception that on a planet of finite resources, economies and populations cannot grow infinitely. This is also why, rather than talking about demographic decline, I'd like to advocate the term demographic change. Less people is not necessarily negative, and this applies even more so during a pandemic. Also, having less people may mean more space and more time to think about one's well-being and reflect on what constitutes just the right amount for oneself and for one's loved ones. So as regards future avenues for us to pursue, rather than trying to come up with a fast and easy answer, I'd like to open up the conversation and emphasize the importance of abandoning conventional binaries once and for all. Local, global, open, closed, urban, rural, industrialized, developing, mainstream, marginal, work, leisure, growth, stagnation, all binaries that seem less and less insightful to think with. So after this trip through emerging forms and meanings of tourism, localities, and lifestyles, I'd now like to briefly reflect on the changing nature of fieldwork. Before the pandemic, when we talked about fieldwork, we're thinking about going places, getting in there, engaging with people, engaging with frogs, getting our hands dirty. Memories of trying to find one's way back in the mountains in an area where GPS doesn't work come to mind. Smells, sweats, fighting with insects. After completing my last follow-up in Tokushima, I remember being elated about being able to sleep soundly, not having to worry about centipedes. Face-to-face fieldwork has long represented the gold standard with regard to methods, while digital ethnography has only been seen as a second-rate complementary option at best. I would never have imagined that fieldwork could mean that one day getting up at 5 a.m. And listening in on a clubhouse group of Japanese migrants who live in the Netherlands from my warm futon. Changing from face-to-face fieldwork with all its visceral stimulations to a mere acoustic format was really challenging. But we can also get so much valuable information by hanging out with people, even if it's a mere acoustic format. So the various episodes and reflections of this talk clearly illustrate the need to radically rethink our practices as researchers, as well as human beings, with the ultimate aim to find just the right amount, as individuals, as groups, as societies, also with consideration for the environment and the post-human. So in other words, in sum, drawing on Arundhati Roy, I hope we can go through the portal, leave anachronistic binaries behind, and work with the emerging paradigms. And on a very last note, I'd like to point out a recent publication, a special issue that I've just co-edited with my colleague Paul Hansen on the theme of exploring rural Japan and heterotopia in Asian anthropology. Thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Klien Sensei. That was a very interesting presentation. It definitely made me reflect on my own decisions and how we should actually consider about how we do research and even reflecting on our everyday life. And you mentioned, you ended it with about how we need to reconsider better ways of doing research. And so I'd like to ask you that question, beyond doing digital research, such as listening to Clubhouse, what do you think we can do as researchers in our own daily life to pursue more environmentally friendly lifestyles?
Yes, thanks for the great question. I think we tend to think that we need to, this is like a big thing, we need to make a big decision, and we tend to underrate ourselves with regard to being able to implement change. But I think there's many small things we can do every day in our daily lives, like, for example, thinking about commuting. Is it really so much better to physically commute into the office? Of course, there are days when we have appointments, when we have meetings, when we need to physically go to places, to a workplace. But in many, I believe that on many occasions, it's more like a habit. Humans are animals of habit. So just by going to the office, we tend to feel that we've already done some work, which I think is quite, quite a myth. So it might be good to really—
psychological aspect.
To think about, yeah, if we commute, we actually also burden the environment through taking transport, through using various things in the office, etc. So this is something that's not really being talked about so much, I think, this kind of burden on the environment through commuting and working at the office.
Exactly. And in a way that relates back to your third point on how governments are actually putting, and they need to put in effort in creating the facilities of digitalization. Because I'm reflecting at 2 years ago, my family actually decided to stay in the village with my grandma. And the challenge there was that while, yes, the thought of workation and doing work in the rural village is great, but the internet was barely there. We'd have to climb up a hill just for an online meeting. So in a way, governments do need to help support and develop all of these facilities too. And also it makes us reflect on how important nature is to us as human beings. That's why we see many people that you said within the age range of 20 to 40 years old having the anxious feelings because they are too ingrained with technology. And we have one last question. Well, not really last. If you do have any questions, feel free to write in the Q&A box. A question from Joseph. He said, just the right amount is an alluring idea. Is this related to the Japanese, let me check. Japanese notion mottainai, or its Swedish equivalent lagom, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. So what are the policy implications for governments that are usually economic growth oriented?
Yes, thanks, Joseph, for the excellent question. I think mottainai is really more about treating various resources with respect, but finding the right amount is more about individual perspectives. There is no fixed amount because it's different for everybody and depending on everyone's circumstance. So it's really like kind of trying to find the right amount of working, the right amount of everything, which kind of, I guess, implies more intuitiveness about one's own needs. and we tend to have very little time left in our busy daily lives to listen to ourselves and listen to our bodies. So I think it's something we really need to take out more time as researchers and as people, I think. Not sure when this answers the questions, but with regard to policy implications, I think a lot of Minkan companies, private companies have already started adapting to people's focus on lifestyles more. So because there's less and less people available as employees. So employees, of course, that puts employees in a strong spot because they can actually choose from the jobs. And so workplaces need to be more competitive and provide more attractive workplaces. So this is why some companies have already cut down on office space, responding to increasing remote work. And also others have relocated their headquarters to rural areas and offered employees to move also to rural areas if they are interested. So I think there's quite a lot of change happening in the corporate sector.
Yeah, and the corporate sector also prioritizing the balance in our lives. And moving on to our next question, our audience is asking, I'm wondering during your research during the pandemic, what was some new ways of doing remote fieldwork or digital ethnography other than Zoom interviews? Is there any other methods you have engaged with, or what would you advise?
Yeah, so I think I've actually used one-to-one interviews, but not just once with one person, but I've tried to, because of course the online format limits a lot of the sensations we can have when we face to face. But I think we can actually get such sensations in a different way by actually kind of meeting up with one and the same person in a regular kind of pace. So, for example, of course, that depends on your interlocutors. But if you feel that there is a kind of good vibe, it makes sense to really set up a conversation. Yeah. So I've tried to do this for my new project, the Transnational Migration Project, which focuses on Japanese who have moved abroad, and many of which work in the IT industry. So they're actually quite used to this format from well before the pandemic. So it feels very natural. And I think we can really focus on content, totally on the content, without any other kind of other stuff that we need to worry about when we meet in person. So I think there's also a lot of benefits. Plus, my experience is also, if I talk to people who are, for example, belong to marginalized groups, be that gender-wise or otherwise, people who don't feel very comfortable to speak out openly, people who are a little bit introverts, they actually prefer online conversation to face-to-face meetings, and I've had very good experience. So I think it's really underrated, and we need to learn more about how to use that kind of the online format.
Very true, and also aspects of building trust through online data collection methods. And we have one more question. We have time for one more question from Dr. Loretta. So the question is, your description of the anxious tourist sounds a lot like people who are seeking more meaning in their life and spirituality. Have you come across this in your research?
Yeah, so this is something I've noticed quite recently, and I do think that is definitely related to seeking a sense of purpose, seeking something related to spirituality or esoteric kind of aspects. So people, I think it's really also related to loneliness of all kinds. So people were living by themselves in big cities, not having any connections with community, having a day job, well, which they do, but they don't have much of a community setting apart from that. So I think it's really like trying to bring more sociality into their lives in a way. And this is also why activities, such very simple activities like working in a field together, is almost like Iyashi, I think. It brings in a sense of it's almost a bit sacred in a way. This kind of
it fulfills your soul. We are social beings and we do need that human interaction. And then if you do live in the village, similar like Yuka-san, I can feel her when she said it feels like there's a constant surveillance where the aunties watching you. But it is a very lovely feeling to know that you do have a community that will support you. And so thank you so much, Klien Sensei. If anyone else, if you do have any other questions, feel free to email her and get the book, read her publications, read her book. And we are going on on a quick break, and you'll be able to see a video of Kansai. And see you in our next session in about 10 minutes, which will be moderated by Nagai Sensei. With that, thank you, Klien Sensei, and thank you everyone. See you in a bit.
Thank you.